You're 32 and still playing with your little computer games? My Aunt Cordelia sneered across the mahogany dining table at the Ravencrest family estate. When are you going to get a real job like your cousins? The entire room erupted in knowing chuckles. Uncle Bartholomew nodded sagely while adjusting his gold cufflinks. Cousin Penelope smirked from behind her wine glass, fresh from her latest promotion at Daddy's law firm. Even my own mother, Vivienne, couldn't hide her embarrassed smile. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I sat there in my thrift store blazer, surrounded by designer suits and inherited jewelry, watching my family dissect my life like vultures picking at roadkill. They called it tough love. I called it the monthly humiliation ritual disguised as Sunday dinner. Catalina, my grandmother Octavia, began, her voice dripping with that particular brand of disappointment she'd perfected over 8 decades. Your grandfather built Ravencrest Industries from nothing. Your father expanded it into 3 countries before he passed. And here you are, 32 years old, still living in that cramped apartment in Millbrook District, making, what do you call them, video games? Interactive software applications, I corrected quietly, but she waved me off like I was speaking gibberish. Applications, games, whatever. The point is, darling, you're wasting your potential. Look at Penelope. She's already made junior partner. Look at your cousin Reginald. He's managing the Shanghai office. And you're sitting there talking about pixels. The laughter that followed felt like acid in my veins, but I smiled politely, cut my overpriced steak into neat little pieces, and swallowed both the food and my pride in equal measure, because this was the deal we'd made, years ago, silently, unspoken, but understood. I would endure their monthly character assassination in exchange for not being completely cut off from the only family I had left. What they didn't know, what none of them sitting in that mahogany-paneled fortress of inherited privilege knew, was that 6 months earlier, I'd received an email that changed everything. The subject line was simple: partnership proposal, Nexus Gaming Solutions. The sender was someone whose name I'd only seen in Forbes articles and tech industry headlines: Jasper Thornfield, CEO of one of the fastest-growing gaming companies in the world. Ms. Ravencrest, the email had begun, we've been following your work, particularly the AI framework you developed for interactive storytelling in intermediate media. We'd like to discuss a potential partnership that could revolutionize how people experience digital narratives. I'd stared at that email for 20 minutes straight, convinced it was spam. Jasper Thornfield knew my work? Nexus Gaming Solutions had been following my projects? The same projects my family dismissed as playing with computers? But sitting there at dinner, listening to Aunt Cordelia explain why my career choice was unbecoming of a Ravencrest, I kept that secret locked away like a diamond in my chest, because I'd learned, over years of these dinners, that sharing good news with my family was like feeding pearls to swine. They'd find a way to diminish it, to explain why it wasn't really success, why it didn't count. The problem with your generation, Uncle Bartholomew pontificated, gesturing with his whiskey tumbler, is that you think innovation means staring at screens all day. Real business happens in boardrooms, Catalina, with handshakes and contracts and actual human interaction. I nodded and smiled, the way that I'd been trained to do since childhood. The way that kept the peace and prevented the lectures from turning into full-scale interventions about my concerning life choices. But inside, I was counting the days until the partnership contract with Nexus would be finalized, counting the hours until I could walk away from these monthly inquisitions with my head held high, counting the seconds until I could prove that my little computer games were about to make me the most successful person in that room. The irony was almost poetic. These people who had built their entire identity around the Ravencrest name and legacy had no idea they were about to witness the birth of something that would eclipse everything their ancestors had ever achieved. They saw failure where venture capitalists saw genius. They saw embarrassment where industry leaders saw innovation. My name is Catalina Ravencrest, and if you think this story is just about family disapproval and tech industry success, you're only seeing the surface. This is about what happens when the people who are supposed to believe in you become the very obstacles you have to overcome. It's about the moment when being underestimated becomes your greatest advantage. Because 3 months after that dinner, when Aunt Cordelia opened her Wall Street Journal to see my face on the front page of the business section, when Uncle Bartholomew read the headline, "Local Tech Prodigy Partners with Gaming Giant in Multi-Million-Dollar Deal," when my mother called me sobbing with pride and regret, they finally understood something I'd known all along. Sometimes the biggest failure is failing to recognize success when it's sitting right across from you at the dinner table. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back to the beginning to show you exactly how a family's disappointment became the fuel for the most satisfying comeback in Ravencrest history. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. What happens when the people who share your DNA become the biggest barriers to your dreams? When family dinners turn into monthly tribunals where your life choices are put on trial? That's exactly what my life had become in the Ravencrest household. You see, being born into the Ravencrest family came with an instruction manual that nobody bothered to give me. Rule number 1, success only counts if it happens in traditional industries. Banking, law, real estate, maybe medicine if you're feeling rebellious. Rule number 2, innovation is suspicious unless it involves buying and selling things that already exist. Rule number 3, if you can't explain your career to Great Aunt Millicent at the country club, then it's not a real career. I'd been breaking all 3 rules for the past 8 years. While my cousin Penelope was climbing the ladder at Ashworth and Associates, the same law firm where 3 generations of Ravencrests had made their mark, I was in my cramped Millbrook apartment at 3 in the morning writing code that could revolutionize how stories unfold in digital spaces. While Reginald was impressing board members in Shanghai with his quarterly reports, I was creating AI algorithms that could adapt narratives based on user emotions in real time. But to my family, I was just the disappointment. The black sheep who chose pixels over profit margins, who preferred debugging code to networking at charity galas. The pattern had been established early. When I graduated summa cum laude with a double major in computer science and interactive media from Thornwick University, the family celebration lasted exactly as long as it took Uncle Bartholomew to ask, "But what are you going to do with that?" When I landed my first job at Quantum Digital Studios, grandmother Octavia's response was, "Well, I suppose everyone needs hobbies." Even my mother, who I knew loved me fiercely, couldn't hide her confusion. "Catalina, sweetheart," she'd say during our private conversations, "I just don't understand why you won't consider the opportunities at Ravencrest Industries. Your father always dreamed of you taking over someday." But here's what none of them understood. I wasn't rejecting the family legacy out of rebellion. I was building something bigger, something that would make their traditional empire look like a corner store compared to a cathedral. The monthly dinners had become a ritual of systematic erosion. Each gathering chipped away a little more at my confidence, made me question whether I was delusional for believing in my vision. Aunt Cordelia had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment. "Oh, Catalina is so creative with her little projects." Uncle Bartholomew specialized in concerned looks and gentle suggestions about more stable career paths. The worst part wasn't the criticism, it was the pity. The way they looked at me like I was a lost child who eventually come to her senses and accept a nice, safe position filing paperwork at Ravencrest Industries. They measured success in country club memberships and vacation home addresses. I measured it in problems solved and barriers broken. They saw my work as an expensive hobby funded by my trust fund. I saw it as the foundation for something that would change how humans interact with technology. For 8 years, I'd been living in 2 worlds, the one in which I was building revolutionary software that industry leaders were starting to notice, and the one where I was the family disappointment who needed to get serious about life. What they didn't know is that their monthly humiliation sessions had become my fuel.
Every dismissive comment, every concerned look, every suggestion that I was wasting my potential, it all went into the fire that kept me coding till dawn, refining algorithms, pushing boundaries. They thought they were saving me from failure. They had no idea they were creating the very determination that would soon make failure impossible. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March during what was supposed to be a casual family gathering to celebrate cousin Penelope's latest promotion to senior associate. The Ravencrest Estate's library was filled with the usual suspects: crystal glasses, imported wine, and the kind of conversations that made my soul feel claustrophobic.
I'd arrived straight from a 12-hour coding session, having finally cracked a particularly complex algorithm that would allow AI characters to develop genuine emotional responses based on player behavior patterns. My eyes were still burning from staring at screens, my hair was in a messy bun held together by a pencil, and I was wearing my favorite debugging hoodie, the one with coffee stains that had become permanent fixtures. The contrast between my appearance and the room full of tailored suits and designer dresses wasn't lost on anyone, especially Aunt Cordelia, who took one look at me and announced to the entire gathering, "Oh my goodness, Catalina, did you come here straight from wherever it is you spend your time?" The laughter was immediate and cutting, but I smiled, took a seat in the corner, and pulled out my laptop to review some code while they celebrated. I thought I could blend into the background, maybe catch up on emails from potential investors who'd been reaching out after seeing my presentation at the Meridian Tech Summit last month. That's when Uncle Bartholomew noticed the screen. "Catalina, for heaven's sake, put that contraption away. We're having a family celebration." His voice carried that particular tone of authority that Ravencrest men perfected in business school, the one that suggested compliance wasn't optional. "I'm just reviewing some work," I said quietly, minimizing the window. "I won't be disruptive." But Grandmother Octavia had already fixed her steely gaze on me. "Work? Is that what we're calling it now?" She turned to address the room like she was delivering a keynote speech. "This is exactly what I've been trying to explain to everyone. This obsession with computers has completely consumed any sense of propriety Catalina once had." The room went quiet in that particular way that happens when you know someone's about to be publicly eviscerated for entertainment. "Grandmother? I was actually just—" No, let me finish." She raised her hand like a traffic cop, and the authority in that gesture silenced me instantly. "We've all been tiptoeing around this for years, but someone needs to say it. Catalina, you're 32 years old. 32! Do you know where your cousin Penelope was at 32? Do you know where your father was?" I did know. I'd heard these comparisons approximately 400 times in the past decade. Your father, God rest his soul, was already running the international division of Ravencrest Industries. He was married to your mother, they'd bought their first house in Kensington Heights, and he was being featured in Business Weekly as one of the top entrepreneurs under 35. The room nodded in solemn agreement, as if witnessing a religious sermon. And here you are, still renting that little apartment, still single, still playing these games. She said the word like it tasted bitter. Still pretending that this hobby is somehow going to transform into a career. Cousin Reginald decided to pile on. "I mean, Kat, we're worried about you. We all are. How long can you keep living off your trust fund while pretending to be an entrepreneur?" That's when something inside me shifted. Not broke, shifted. Like a tectonic plate finding a new position. "Trust fund?" I asked quietly. "Well, yes," Aunt Cordelia chimed in. "How else could you afford to spend years on this computer thing without any real income?" The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway, could hear Uncle Bartholomew's ice cubes clinking against his glass. "I haven't touched my trust fund in 6 years,"
I said, my voice steady, but carrying an edge that made several people shift uncomfortably in their chairs. "Oh, Catalina," my mother said, with that particular blend of sympathy and disbelief that mothers perfect when they think their children are lying to save face. "Sweetheart, you don't have to pretend. We know things have been difficult." But I was already pulling out my phone, opening my banking app, and for the first time in 8 years of these humiliations, I was done pretending their ignorance was something I needed to protect them from. The apartment in Millbrook, I bought it 3 years ago. Paid cash. I turned the phone screen toward the room. The car? Bought and paid for. The equipment in my home office. Every laptop, every server, every piece of technology that you've dismissed as toys, I bought with money I earned. The room had gone completely silent now. The kind of quiet that happens when someone starts sharing information that makes everyone else uncomfortable. And as for my hobby, I continued, standing up for the first time in any of these confrontations, last month alone, I made more money licensing my software than Penelope's entire annual salary.
Penelope's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. "But that's not the best part," I said, feeling 8 years of swallowed pride finally finding its voice. "The best part is that while you've all been concerned about my lack of real income, I've been building something that's about to make every business venture in this family's history look like a lemonade stand." Grandmother Octavia's face had gone through several shades of color, settling on something between confusion and indignation. 3 weeks ago, I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word, I received a partnership offer from Nexus Gaming Solutions. You might not know the name, but their CEO, Jasper Thornfield, has been personally reviewing my work for the past 6 months. Uncle Bartholomew's cufflinks suddenly didn't seem so impressive. They want to buy my AI framework and make me co-founder of their new interactive media division. The initial offer is $12 million, plus equity, plus a guaranteed development budget of $50 million over the next 3 years. The silence was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat. "So when you ask me when I'm going to get a real job," I said, closing my laptop and sliding it into my bag, "the answer is, I already have one. I have had one for years. You just never bothered to ask what it actually was." I stood up, smoothed down my coffee-stained hoodie, and looked around the room one final time. "Enjoy celebrating Penelope's promotion. It's a wonderful achievement. I meant that sincerely. But next time you're worried about my career prospects, maybe consider that the reason I don't talk about my work at these dinners isn't because I'm ashamed of it. It's because I've learned that some people are more comfortable with their assumptions than they are with the truth." As I walked toward the library door, I could feel 8 years of accumulated silence finally breaking open behind me. But for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't staying to manage their reactions or smooth over the discomfort my honesty had created. I had a partnership contract to review, and for once in my life, I had better things to do than convince my family that my dreams were worth taking seriously. The drive home from the estate felt like floating through a different dimension. For the first time in 8 years, I wasn't replaying family conversations in my head, analyzing what I could have said differently, or wondering if I'd been too sensitive. Instead, I was thinking about the email sitting in my inbox, the one that had arrived just that morning while my family was preparing to dissect my life choices over imported wine and inherited furniture. What they didn't know, what I hadn't mentioned in my dramatic exit speech, was that the Nexus Gaming Solutions partnership was just the tip of the iceberg. It was the visible part of something much larger that I'd been building in the shadows while they assumed I was failing. The truth was, I hadn't just stumbled into success despite their disapproval. I had systematically constructed an empire of innovation using their dismissal as camouflage. Every time they called my work a hobby, it gave me perfect cover to operate under their radar. Every time they assumed I was struggling financially, it protected me from their interference and unsolicited business advice. You see, when your family thinks you're a failure, they stop paying attention to what you're actually doing. and that inattention had become my greatest strategic advantage. While Uncle Bartholomew was lecturing me about real business happening in boardrooms, I was conducting virtual meetings with CEOs from my home office, wearing pajama pants below my professional blazer, negotiating licensing deals worth more than his annual salary. While Aunt Cordelia was concerned about my lack of proper networking, I was building relationships with industry leaders who saw my work featured in MIT Technology Review and Wired magazine. The morning's email had been from Dr. Miranda Ashford, the Chief Technology Officer at Quantum Dynamics Corporation, a company so cutting-edge that most people had never heard of them, but every major tech company was trying to poach their employees. She'd written, "Miss Ravencrest, we've been following your breakthrough work in adaptive AI storytelling. We'd like to discuss acquiring your entire portfolio for our new human-computer interaction division. Please call at your earliest convenience to discuss terms." I'd read that email 3 times before the phone rang. Dr. Miranda Ashford herself was on the line. Not an assistant, not a department head, but the woman who'd been featured on the cover of Innovation Quarterly as the mind behind tomorrow's technology.
"Catalina," she'd said, as if we were old colleagues, "your work is exactly what we've been searching for. The emotional response algorithms you've developed don't just change gaming, they change everything. Healthcare simulations, educational software, therapeutic applications, corporate training. We're looking at technology that could revolutionize how humans learn and heal through interactive experiences." The conversation that followed was the kind that changes your understanding of your own capabilities. Dr. Ashford explained how my AI framework could be adapted for medical students to practice difficult conversations with virtual patients, how it could help children with autism develop social skills through responsive digital characters, how it could create therapeutic environments for trauma survivors. "We're prepared to offer you $15 million for the current portfolio," she'd said, "plus a position as Director of Adaptive Technologies, plus funding for your own research lab. But frankly, Catalina, we're more interested in your brain than your current work. We want to know what you'll create next." $15 million from a company I'd only dreamed of working with, for technology I'd developed in my cramped little apartment while my family worried about my lack of real career prospects. But even that wasn't the biggest secret I'd been carrying. 3 months earlier, I'd received a call from someone whose name I'd only seen in Forbes lists and TED Talk lineups. Alexander Chen, the founder of Meridian Venture Capital. Not his assistant, not his investment team, but Alexander Chen himself, calling my personal number at 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening. "Ms. Ravencrest, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. I saw your presentation at the Tech Summit, and I've spent the last week researching your work. I think you're sitting on technology that could define the next decade of human-computer interaction." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. By the end, he'd outlined a plan to help me form my own company, with Meridian providing seed funding and strategic guidance. We're talking about building something entirely new. Not just a gaming company, not just a software company, but a new category entirely. Interactive intelligence. Technology that doesn't just respond to users, but actually understands and grows with them. The preliminary term sheet he'd sent was for $25 million in funding, with the potential for Series A funding up to $100 million within 18 months. He wanted me to be CEO of my own company, with complete creative control and a development team of world-class engineers and designers. "Catalina," he'd said before ending the call, "in 15 years of venture capital, I've rarely seen technology with this kind of transformative potential developed by someone working independently. Most breakthroughs this significant come from massive research teams with unlimited budgets. The fact that you've created this in your home office tells me we're looking at a once-in-a-generation innovator." That conversation had been 3 months ago. The contracts were sitting in my lawyer's office, waiting for my signature. I'd been holding off, not because I was uncertain, but because I was methodically evaluating every option that kept appearing on my horizon.
While my family was concerned about my lack of real job prospects, I was choosing between offers that would make me one of the youngest self-made tech entrepreneurs in the country. The irony was breathtaking. Their concern about my financial stability had protected me from their interference during the most crucial phase of my career development. Their assumption that I was struggling had given me the space to build something extraordinary without their well-meaning but ultimately limiting advice. Uncle Bartholomew's lectures about real business happening in boardrooms missed the fact that the most important business conversations of my life were happening in video calls from my home office with people who understood that innovation doesn't always look like what came before it. Aunt Cordelia's worries about my networking overlooked the reality that I was building relationships with the most influential minds in emerging technology, people who measured success in problems solved and barriers broken, not in country club memberships and vacation home addresses. But perhaps the most beautiful irony was this. While they'd been trying to save me from failure, their dismissal had accidentally created the perfect conditions for unprecedented success. Their low expectations had removed all pressure to conform to traditional career paths, giving me the freedom to pursue something genuinely revolutionary. As I pulled into my driveway that Tuesday evening, I realized that everything was about to change, not just for me, but for them. Tomorrow, I would sign the partnership agreement with Nexus Gaming Solutions. Next week, I would accept Dr. Ashford's offer from Quantum Dynamics. And within a month, I would announce the formation of my own company backed by Meridian Venture Capital. The family that had spent 8 years worrying about my lack of real career prospects was about to discover that their biggest concern should have been keeping up with the success they'd been too distracted to notice. But tonight, I was still their secret. Tomorrow, I would become their shock.
Wednesday morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity that comes from finally understanding exactly what you need to do. Not in a rush, not from emotion, but with the methodical precision of someone who's spent 8 years learning how to turn dismissal into fuel and humiliation into strategy. The first call I made was to my lawyer, Harrison Blackthorne, at precisely 8:30 a.m. Harrison specialized in tech acquisitions and had been handling my intellectual property portfolio for the past 3 years. He was one of the few people who truly understood the scope of what I'd been building. "Harrison, it's time," I said without preamble. "I want to execute everything we've discussed, but I want it done in a very specific sequence." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. The family finally pushed too far? Let's just say they've made it clear that they're more comfortable with their assumptions than they are with reality. I think it's time to introduce them to reality on my terms. What followed was a 90-minute strategic planning session that would have impressed the war room at any Fortune 500 company. We mapped out a timeline that was both legally sound and strategically devastating. Every signature, every announcement, every public revelation would be timed for maximum impact and minimum opportunity for interference. The beauty of my position was that I'd been preparing for this moment for years without even realizing it. Every contract I'd negotiated included specific confidentiality clauses that protected my privacy until I chose to go public. Every partnership agreement included ironclad protections against outside interference. I'd built a fortress around my work, and now it was time to open the gates and show the world what was inside. By 10 a.m., I was sitting in the conference room at Nexus Gaming Solutions, facing Jasper Thornfield across a mahogany table that made my family's dining room look quaint. But this mahogany represented something entirely different: earned respect, mutual admiration, and a shared vision for the future of interactive technology. Catalina, I have to tell you, in 20 years of business, I've rarely been this excited about a collaboration. Your AI framework doesn't just improve our games, it creates an entirely new category of experience. I read through the contract one final time, though Harrison and I had already reviewed every clause. $12 million for the initial licensing deal, plus a guaranteed minimum of $8 million in annual licensing fees for the next 5 years. Co-founder title with full creative control over the interactive intelligence division. Equity position that would be worth significantly more than the cash if the company performed as projected. But beyond the numbers, there was something else in this contract that my family would never understand. The clause that gave me complete authority to develop my technology in whatever direction I saw fit, with no oversight from traditional business models or conventional thinking. I signed my name with the same pen I'd used to write code for 8 years in my cramped little apartment. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Welcome to the future, co-founder Ravencrest," he said, shaking my hand. "Our legal team will file the partnership announcement with the SEC this afternoon. The press release goes out tomorrow morning." The second meeting of the day was at Quantum Dynamics Corporation in Dr. Miranda Ashford's corner office overlooking the Meridian River. Dr. Ashford was exactly what I'd expected from our phone conversations. Brilliant, direct, and completely unimpressed by anything that wasn't genuinely innovative. "Dr. Ashford, I'll be honest with you. We've been tracking your work for 18 months. The breakthrough you achieved in emotional response algorithms is the kind of advancement that typically takes research teams decades to develop. The fact that you did it independently tells us everything we need to know about your capabilities." The Quantum Dynamics deal was structured differently from Nexus, a complete acquisition of my therapeutic and educational applications for $15 million, plus a position as Director of Adaptive Technologies with an annual salary that exceeded what most CEOs earned. More importantly, it included funding for my own research lab with a 10-person team and a 5-year budget of $30 million. "We're not just buying your current work," Dr. Ashford explained. "We're investing in your future innovations. Our board wants to know what Catalina Ravencrest will create next." I signed that contract at 2:47 p.m., officially becoming one of the highest-paid technology directors in the industry. The third and final meeting of the day was with Alexander Chen at Meridian Venture Capital. By the time I arrived at their downtown offices, word of the Nexus partnership was already circulating in tech industry circles. Alexander greeted me with a smile that suggested he'd been anticipating this moment.
"I see you've had a productive day," he said, gesturing toward the stack of signed contracts in my briefcase. "Are you ready to make it even more interesting?" The Meridian deal was the most complex of the three, but also the most transformative. $25 million in seed funding to establish my own company, Adaptive Intelligence Solutions, with the potential for Series A funding up to $100 million within 18 months. I would be CEO with complete operational control and a board seat for life. But the most beautiful part of the Meridian agreement was the timeline. Alexander wanted to announce the company formation and funding within 2 weeks, culminating in a press conference that would officially introduce Adaptive Intelligence Solutions to the world. "Catalina," Alexander said as I signed the final page, "in 6 months, you're going to be featured on the cover of every major business publication in the country. Are you prepared for that level of visibility?" I thought about my family's monthly humiliation dinners, about 8 years of swallowing pride and managing their disappointment. I think I'm ready for people to see what I've actually been working on. By 6 p.m., I was back in my apartment, the same cramped little space where I'd built technology that 3 major companies had just valued at over $50 million. But tonight, it didn't feel cramped. It felt like mission control. I opened my laptop and began drafting 3 emails. Not to my family. They would learn about my success the same way everyone else would, through official announcements and press coverage. These emails were to the tech journalists who'd been following my work, the conference organizers who'd been inviting me to speak, and the investors who'd been trying to get meetings for months. The subject line was simple: available for interviews beginning tomorrow. But before I sent those emails, I did something I'd never done before in 8 years of family gatherings. I created a calendar invitation for this Sunday's dinner at the Ravencrest estate.
Not because I wanted to attend, but because I wanted to be there when they opened their morning newspapers and saw my face on the business section. I wanted to be present for the moment when they realized that while they'd been concerned about my lack of real career prospects, I'd been quietly building the most successful tech startup launch in recent industry history. The invitation I sent to my mother was polite and brief. Looking forward to Sunday dinner. I have some news to share. By Thursday morning, the first announcement would go public. By Friday, the second deal would be revealed. By Sunday, when I walked into that library where they'd spent years dissecting my life choices, I would be the co-founder of a major gaming company, the director of revolutionary technology research, and the CEO of my own venture capital-backed startup. But more than that, I would be finally free from the exhausting performance of pretending their approval mattered more than my own success. The best revenge, I'd learned, wasn't proving them wrong. It was building something so undeniably successful that their opinions became irrelevant. Thursday morning at 6:47 a.m., my phone started buzzing like an angry hornet. The first call was from my mother, her voice pitched high with confusion and something that might have been panic. Catalina, sweetheart, I don't understand. Mrs. Pemberton called me at 6:30 in the morning, 6:30, asking if she'd seen the business section. She said there's a picture of you and some article about gaming companies. And, honey, I'm looking at it right now, and I don't understand what I'm reading. I was sitting in my kitchen, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise through the window while the first domino of my carefully orchestrated revelation fell exactly as planned. The Nexus Gaming Solutions partnership announcement had hit the newsstands and digital platforms simultaneously with the professional headshot I'd taken last month specifically for this moment. "Mom," I said calmly, "what specifically don't you understand?" "It says here that you're the co-founder of something called an interactive intelligence division, and there are numbers? Catalina, these numbers can't be right. It says $12 million. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Uncle Bartholomew. Then another buzz. Aunt Cordelia. Then Cousin Penelope. Within 10 minutes, my phone was lighting up like a Christmas tree with calls from family members who apparently read the business section much more carefully than they'd ever listened to me explain my actual work. I let them all go to voicemail. This wasn't the time for individual explanations or damage control. This was the time to let the reality of my success sink in without my help or interpretation. The voicemails, when I finally listened to them, were a fascinating study of cognitive dissonance. Uncle Bartholomew's message was particularly revealing. "Catalina, I'm looking at this article about you and some gaming company, and I think there might be some kind of mistake. The numbers they're quoting don't make sense for the kind of work we thought you were doing. Could you call me back? I think we need to talk about what's actually happening here."
Aunt Cordelia's message was more direct. "Catalina Marie Ravencrest, I have 17 people calling me this morning asking if you're the same Catalina Ravencrest mentioned in this article. I told them there must be some confusion because you work with computers, not whatever this is saying. Please call me immediately." But it was Cousin Reginald's voicemail that truly captured the family state of mind. "Cat, what the hell is going on? I'm getting texts from my business school friends asking if I'm related to the Catalina Ravencrest who just became co-founder of a major tech company. I told them you were still figuring out your career path. Now they're asking me if I knew you were sitting on this kind of breakthrough technology. I look like an idiot. Call me back." The beautiful thing about carefully orchestrated revelations is that they create a specific type of chaos, the kind where people scramble to understand information that contradicts everything they thought they knew. By 10 a.m., I had 23 missed calls, 47 text messages, and a voice note from grandmother Octavia that was so bewildered, it was almost endearing. "Catalina, dear, I've been trying to understand this newspaper article, but it might as well be written in a foreign language. It says you're some kind of technology entrepreneur, and there are quotes from people I've never heard of saying extraordinary things about your work. Could you please come to the house this afternoon so we can discuss what's really happening?" What was really happening, of course, was that 8 years of assumptions were colliding with reality in real time. And my family was experiencing the vertigo that comes from discovering that everything you thought you knew about someone was fundamentally incorrect. The text messages were equally illuminating. Penelope sent, "Kat, people at my firm are asking me about your AI patents. I didn't even know you had patents. What patents?" My mother texted, "Sweetheart, I'm getting calls from the country club. Mrs. Ashworth says her son works in technology, and he's very impressed by something called your emotional response algorithms. I don't understand what that means, but he seems to think it's important." But the text that truly captured the family state of mind came from my cousin Margaret, who lived in California and typically only communicated with the family through holiday cards. "Just saw the news about your company partnership. Mom called crying because she thinks the newspaper made a mistake and printed someone else's picture next to your name. She can't understand how you could be involved in anything worth $12 million. Are you okay? Did someone steal your identity?" By noon, the panic had evolved into a more sophisticated form of confusion. Uncle Bartholomew had apparently spent the morning making phone calls to his business contacts, trying to understand what interactive intelligence actually meant and why companies were paying millions of dollars for it. His second voicemail reflected this research. "Catalina, I've been making some calls, and apparently this technology you've developed is being described as revolutionary by people who would know. I think we need to have a serious conversation about what you've been working on and why none of us understood the significance." The afternoon brought a new wave of family chaos as word of the quantum dynamics announcement hit the tech blogs and industry publications. This time, the calls came faster and with a sharper edge of panic, because the quantum dynamics deal wasn't just about gaming, it was about medical applications, educational technology, and therapeutic software. Aunt Cordelia's second call of the day was pure bewilderment. "Catalina, I just received a call from Dr. Peterson. You remember, she's on the hospital board with me. She's asking me about your therapeutic software applications and whether you're the same person who's being recruited by major medical technology companies. I told her I thought you made video games, and she looked like I was speaking nonsense." The most telling reaction came from my mother's voice note that evening. "Sweetheart, I've been on the phone all day with people congratulating me on your success, and I've been having to pretend I understand what they're talking about. Mrs. Whitmore from the Garden Club says her grandson is studying computer science at Stanford, and when she mentioned your name, he got very excited and started explaining something about artificial intelligence that sounded like science fiction. Catalina, I feel like I don't know you at all." That last line hit differently than the others because it wasn't angry or confused, it was heartbroken. My mother was realizing that she'd spent years dismissing something she'd never taken the time to understand. And now she was discovering that her dismissal had caused her to miss the most important professional development in her daughter's life. By Thursday evening, the family group chat had devolved into a mixture of celebration, confusion, and recrimination. Some cousins were posting links to articles about my work with excited congratulations. Others were asking pointed questions about why no one had known the scope of my success. A few were expressing hurt that I hadn't shared my achievements with the family. But the message that captured everything came from grandmother Octavia at 8:43 p.m. "Catalina, I've spent today trying to understand how I could have been so wrong about what you were accomplishing. I owe you an apology, but more than that, I owe you the respect I should have shown years ago. Please come to dinner Sunday so we can discuss this properly." As I read that message, I realized that the panic phase was ending and the reckoning phase was about to begin. They were starting to understand that their concern about my career prospects had been based on ignorance, not insight. They were beginning to grasp that their monthly interventions about my lack of success had been taking place while I was achieving the kind of breakthrough that most entrepreneurs only dream of. But tomorrow would bring the third announcement, the Meridian Venture Capital funding and the launch of my own company. If today had shaken their understanding of my capabilities, tomorrow would shatter their assumptions about my ambitions. The family that had spent 8 years worried about my failure was about to learn that their biggest oversight wasn't recognizing my success, it was underestimating how much success I was capable of achieving. Friday morning brought the second wave of revelations, and with it, the deeper questions that my family was finally ready to ask. But before I could address their newfound curiosity about my actual career, I needed to understand exactly how deep their misconceptions had run and why those misconceptions had been so easy for them to maintain. The truth was, their ignorance hadn't been accidental. It had been carefully cultivated over 8 years of willful dismissal, selective hearing, and a fundamental inability to imagine that success could look different from what they'd always known. Let me take you back to the beginning to show you exactly how a family can spend nearly a decade completely missing the most significant professional development happening right under their noses. It started in my final year at Thornwick University when I was simultaneously completing my double major and developing the preliminary framework for what would eventually become my emotional response AI. I was spending 18-hour days in the computer lab working on algorithms that could analyze user behavior patterns and generate appropriate emotional responses in real time. When I tried to explain this to my family during Thanksgiving dinner that year, Uncle Bartholomew had interrupted me mid-sentence. "Catalina, you're talking about computers like they're people. They don't have emotions, sweetheart. They just follow programming." I had tried to explain that I wasn't giving computers emotions. I was teaching them to recognize and respond to human emotions in ways that felt natural and supportive. But Aunt Cordelia had already moved the conversation to Penelope's internship at the law firm, and my explanation was forgotten before I'd finished making it. That became the pattern. I would attempt to share my work, they would demonstrate their fundamental misunderstanding of what I was trying to accomplish, and then they would redirect the conversation to achievements they could more easily comprehend and celebrate. After graduation, when I landed my first position at Quantum Digital Studios, I had been genuinely excited to share the news. This wasn't just any entry-level job. I was being hired specifically to develop interactive narrative systems that could adapt to user preferences in real time. The salary was competitive, the work was exactly what I had been training for, and I was joining a team of some of the most innovative minds in the industry. But when I announced this at the family dinner, Grandmother Octavia's response was immediate and devastating. "Well, I suppose we all need to start somewhere. I'm sure once you get some experience, you'll be able to move into a more traditional company." The assumption embedded in that response was breathtaking, that my carefully chosen position at a cutting-edge technology company was somehow a stepping stone to something more legitimate, rather than exactly where I wanted to be building exactly the kind of technology I was passionate about creating. Over the following months, I tried repeatedly to explain the significance of the projects I was working on. When I successfully developed an AI character that could maintain consistent personality traits while adapting dialogue based on user emotional state, I thought surely this achievement would translate into something my family could appreciate. I was wrong. Uncle Bartholomew's response, "That's nice, dear. Maybe you could use those programming skills to help streamline the inventory system at Ravencrest Industries." When my work was featured in a technical journal for the first time, I brought a copy to the next family dinner, hoping they might read it and finally understand what I was actually accomplishing. The article described my innovation in computational empathy and its potential applications beyond entertainment software. Aunt Cordelia had glanced at the journal cover and said, "Oh, how wonderful that they're writing about hobbies now." Though I have to say, I preferred magazines when they focused on more practical subjects. The most painful example came 2 years into my career, when I received my first major industry recognition, the Innovation Award from the Interactive Media Association for breakthrough work in adaptive storytelling technology. This wasn't a participation trophy. It was recognition from the top professionals in my field that I had created something genuinely groundbreaking. I had been so proud, so certain that this external validation would finally help my family understand the significance of my work. I brought the award to the next family gathering, along with the program from the ceremony that listed the previous winners, people who had gone on to found major companies, revolutionize entire industries, and shape the future of technology. My mother's reaction was the one that still stung years later. "That's lovely, sweetheart. I'm sure it will look nice on your resume when you're ready to apply for more stable positions." The phrase, "more stable positions," revealed everything about how they viewed my career. To them, recognition from industry leaders, breakthrough innovations, and competitive salaries were all just temporary diversions from the real goal of finding a stable job that looked like the careers they understood. But perhaps the most damaging pattern was how they consistently minimized my financial independence. Every time I mentioned a successful project, a salary increase, or a consultation opportunity, they would nod politely and then immediately shift to expressing concern about my long-term financial security. 3 years ago, when I had saved enough to buy my apartment in Millbrook, a significant achievement for someone my age in that market, Uncle Bartholomew's response had been, "Well, it's good that you're investing your trust fund wisely." When I corrected him, explaining that I hadn't touched my trust fund and had saved the down payment from my earnings, Aunt Cordelia had actually patted my hand sympathetically and said, "Oh, sweetheart, you don't have to pretend with us. We know technology jobs can be unpredictable." The assumption that I was lying about my own financial situation was perhaps the most insulting aspect of their willful ignorance. They found it easier to believe that I was secretly struggling and too proud to admit it than to accept that their understanding of my career was fundamentally flawed. Last year, when I mentioned that I was considering buying a second property as an investment, the family's response was immediate and coordinated concern. Mother called me privately the next day to suggest I speak with their financial advisor about more conservative investment strategies. Uncle Bartholomew sent me articles about the dangers of overextending yourself financially in unstable career fields. They were so convinced that my success was an illusion that they actively tried to protect me from making decisions based on what they assumed was a false understanding of my own financial situation. The most revealing moment came 6 months ago, during the conversation that had ultimately led to my decision to stop protecting them from reality. Cousin Penelope had been complaining about her student loan payments, and I had mentioned that I had been fortunate to pay mine off early. "How early?" she had asked. "About 4 years ago," I replied. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Uncle Bartholomew had said, with genuine concern, "Catalina, if you used your trust fund to pay off student loans, that might not have been the wisest financial decision. Student loan interest rates are typically much lower than what you could earn investing that money." Once again, they had chosen to believe that I was making poor financial decisions with inherited money, rather than accept that I was making excellent financial decisions with money I had earned through work they refused to understand or validate. That night, I had finally understood something crucial. Their concern about my career wasn't based on love or genuine worry about my well-being. It was based on their inability to imagine that success could look different from what they had always known. Their monthly interventions weren't attempts to help me, they were attempts to force me into a version of success that would make them comfortable.
And that's when I realized that I owed them nothing. Not explanations, not patience, not protection from the reality of what I had been building while they were busy trying to save me from my own choices. The family that had spent 8 years worrying about my financial instability was about to learn that their concern had been based not on my actual circumstances, but on their failure to recognize financial success when it didn't fit their predetermined expectations. Friday afternoon brought the third announcement, and with it, a level of family chaos that even I hadn't fully anticipated. The Meridian Venture Capital funding announcement hit the tech world like a seismic event, and the ripple effects reached far beyond my family's comfortable bubble of assumptions. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came at 2:17 p.m., when my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional. "Ms. Ravencrest, this is Diana Hartwell from the Meridian Times business desk. We're preparing a feature story about your company launch and the venture capital funding. Would you be available for an interview this afternoon?" By 3 p.m., I had received interview requests from 6 major publications, 3 tech podcasts, and a producer from the local morning television show.
The story wasn't just about my success anymore. It was becoming a narrative about the largest tech startup funding in the region's history, anchored by a local entrepreneur who had been operating under the radar for years. But the real indicator of how significantly the landscape had changed came in the form of an email from Winston Blackwood, the president of Meridian Country Club, the same country club where my family had been members for 3 generations and where my career had been a source of polite embarrassment for nearly a decade. Dear Ms. Ravencrest, the email began, congratulations on your remarkable achievements in the technology sector. The membership committee would be honored to invite you to speak at our upcoming Business Leaders Luncheon about entrepreneurship and innovation in emerging industries. We believe our members would benefit greatly from your insights. The irony was so sharp, it was almost surgical. The same institution where my work had been dismissed as computer games was now inviting me to educate their membership about the future of technology and business. But if I thought the family's response to this escalation would be straightforward celebration, I was underestimating their capacity for cognitive dissonance and damage control. The first attempt at narrative management came from Uncle Bartholomew, who called me Friday evening with what he clearly believed was a helpful offer. Catalina, I've been thinking about your situation, and I want you to know that Ravencrest Industries is prepared to offer you a position as Chief Technology Officer. We could really use someone with your expertise to modernize our operations. The audacity was breathtaking. After 8 years of suggesting that my work wasn't real business, he was now trying to recruit me to bring legitimacy to their traditional company. But more than that, he was attempting to subsume my independent success into the family business narrative. Uncle Bartholomew, I said carefully, I appreciate the offer, but I'm currently the CEO of my own company with $25 million in funding and a board of directors who are counting on my full attention. There was a pause. Well, yes, but family businesses have more stability. This venture capital thing can be very volatile. You'd have much more security with us. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence of my success, he was still trying to save me from my own achievements. Aunt Cordelia's approach was more subtle but equally revealing. She had spent Friday afternoon making calls to various family friends and acquaintances, apparently attempting to gather information about whether my success was legitimate or somehow artificially inflated by media attention. Her call to me Friday night was a masterclass in passive-aggressive inquiry disguised as concern. Darling, I've been getting so many calls about your wonderful news, and everyone is asking me to explain exactly what your company does. I hate to admit that I'm not entirely clear on the details. Could you help me understand what interactive intelligence actually means in terms that someone without a technical background could grasp? The request seemed reasonable on the surface, but embedded within it was a deeper challenge. Prove to me that this is real and significant enough for me to defend to my social circle. But the most sophisticated resistance came from cousin Penelope, who had apparently spent her Friday evening researching startup failure rates and the volatility of venture capital funding. Her approach was to undermine my achievements by highlighting the risks and uncertainties associated with entrepreneurship. Kat, I'm really excited for you, but I hope you're being realistic about the challenges ahead. I've been reading about tech startups, and the statistics are pretty sobering. Most venture-funded companies fail within the first 2 years. Have you considered what you'll do if this doesn't work out? The beautiful irony of receiving risk management advice from someone who had never started a business, never received venture funding, and had spent the previous week expressing concern about my lack of real career prospects was not lost on me.
But perhaps the most telling response came from my mother, who had clearly been designated as the family's emotional ambassador for damage control. Her call Friday night was different from the others. Softer, more personal, but ultimately more manipulative. "Sweetheart, I need you to know how proud I am of you," she began, and for a moment I allowed myself to hope that she had finally understood what I had been building. "But I'm also worried that all this attention and success might change you. Promise me you won't forget your family in all of this." The implication was clear. My success was potentially dangerous to family relationships, and I needed to be managed to prevent it from disrupting the established order. "Mom," I said, "my success doesn't change who I am, but it might change how you see me." "That's exactly what I'm worried about," she replied. And in that response, I heard the core of the family's resistance. They weren't afraid that I would fail. They were afraid that I would succeed so dramatically that their previous treatment of me would be exposed as fundamentally wrong. The weekend brought a new level of social pressure as word of my achievements spread through their network of friends, colleagues, and professional associates. By Saturday morning, my family members were fielding calls from people who wanted to know more about my work, congratulate them on my success, and in some cases, explore potential business opportunities. Uncle Bartholomew called me Saturday afternoon with barely contained frustration. "Catalina, I just spent an hour on the phone with Harold Whitmore explaining what your company does, and I realized I don't actually understand it myself. This is becoming embarrassing. People are asking me detailed questions about artificial intelligence and venture capital, and I sound like an idiot." The complaint revealed everything. His primary concern wasn't my success or the opportunities it created, but the social discomfort of being associated with achievements he couldn't explain or take credit for. Aunt Cordelia's Saturday evening call was even more direct. "Catalina, people are starting to ask why the family wasn't more supportive of your work. Mrs. Patterson actually asked me why we hadn't been bragging about having a tech entrepreneur in the family. I didn't know what to say." The question she was really asking was, how do we rewrite history so that our 8 years of dismissal and concern become 8 years of quiet support and family pride? But the most revealing moment came in a group text thread Saturday night where various family members began discussing how to handle my newfound visibility. The conversation included suggestions about family interviews, coordinated social media posts, and strategies for positioning the family as having always been supportive of my entrepreneurial endeavors. Cousin Reginald's contribution was particularly illuminating. "We should probably get ahead of this narrative-wise. If reporters start asking about family support, we want to make sure we're all telling the same story." The idea that they needed to coordinate a story about their support for my career, rather than simply telling the truth about their 8 years of concern and dismissal, revealed how fundamentally they misunderstood both my success and their role in it. By Sunday morning, as I prepared for what would be the most interesting family dinner in Ravencrest history, I realized that their resistance wasn't really about protecting me or managing risks. It was about protecting themselves from the implications of having been so completely wrong about something so important for so long. They weren't afraid of my failure anymore. They were afraid of their own exposure. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that comes from knowing you're about to walk into a room where every assumption will be challenged and every relationship will be redefined. But before I headed to the Ravencrest estate for what promised to be the most consequential family dinner in our history, I received a phone call that changed everything I thought I knew about how my work had been perceived in professional circles. The call came at 9:23 a.m. from Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the Director of Innovation Research at the Stanford Institute for Technology and Society. Dr. Rodriguez was someone whose work I had followed for years, a respected academic whose research on human-computer interaction had shaped policies at major tech companies and influenced university curricula worldwide. "Miss Ravenscrest," she began, "I hope you don't mind me calling on a Sunday, but I wanted to reach out personally before the formal announcement. We've been tracking your work for 18 months, and the Stanford Institute would like to offer you a visiting researcher position for our upcoming study on ethical AI development and emotional computing." I was quiet for a moment, processing not just the offer, but the timeline she'd mentioned. "You said you've been tracking my work for 18 months? Actually, longer than that, Dr. Rodriguez admitted. Your early papers on computational empathy caught our attention 3 years ago. We've been following your patent applications, your conference presentations, and your development work through various industry connections. Frankly, we've been waiting for you to emerge from the private sector so we could approach you about academic collaboration. 3 years. While my family was expressing concern about my career prospects, Stanford researchers had been monitoring my work as a significant contribution to the field. While Uncle Bartholomew was suggesting I needed real business experience, academic institutions were considering me for positions typically reserved for established researchers with decades of experience. Dr. Rodriguez, I said carefully, when you say you've been following my work through industry connections, what exactly does that mean? Well, your reputation in professional circles has been building for quite some time. Dr. Miranda Ashford at Quantum Dynamics has mentioned your work in several academic papers. Jasper Thornfield from Nexus Gaming has referenced your innovations in conference keynotes. Alexander Chen from Meridian Venture Capital has been telling people for months that you represent the future of human-computer interaction. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, during which Dr. Rodriguez outlined not just the Stanford opportunity, but a broader picture of how my work was being discussed in academic and professional circles that I had never even known were paying attention. Catalina, she said before ending the call, I think you may not fully realize how significant your contributions have been to the field. The work you've done independently rivals research coming out of major university labs with teams of graduate students and unlimited funding. That's extremely rare. By the time I arrived at the Ravencrest estate at noon, I was carrying not just the weight of 3 major business deals, but the knowledge that my professional reputation extended far beyond what even I had understood. The family was assembled in the main dining room, not the library where our confrontations usually took place, but the formal dining space reserved for important occasions. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. This wasn't going to be a casual family gathering where my career could be dismissed as a side topic. But before anyone could speak, Uncle Bartholomew's phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and his face went pale. I'm sorry, I need to take this. It's Senator Morrison's office. The conversation that followed was brief but audible to everyone in the room. Yes, this is Bartholomew Ravencrest. Yes, she is my niece. No, I wasn't aware of the full scope of her achievements. Yes, I understand this is about the Technology Innovation Committee. When he hung up, the room was completely silent. That was Senator Morrison's chief of staff, Uncle Bartholomew said, his voice carefully controlled. Apparently, Catalina, you're being considered for appointment to the State Technology Innovation Advisory Committee. They wanted to verify your family connections and get a reference about your character and professional standing. Aunt Cordelia leaned forward. What did you tell them? I told them, Uncle Bartholomew said slowly, that I would need to call them back after I had a conversation with my niece about her recent achievements. The admission that he couldn't provide a reference for my professional work because he didn't understand it was perhaps the most honest thing any family member had said about my career in 8 years. But the external validation was just beginning. During lunch, Grandmother Octavia's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it, looked confused, and read it again. Catalina, dear, I just received a message from Patricia Whitmore. She says her son called her from Stanford specifically to tell you that you're being discussed in his graduate program as an example of breakthrough independent research. He wanted to know if we could arrange an introduction because he's writing his thesis on adaptive AI systems. Before I could respond, my mother's phone rang. The conversation was brief, but her expression shifted from confusion to something approaching awe. That was Dr. Harrison from the University Hospital. He's calling because he heard about your work in therapeutic applications and wants to discuss a potential collaboration for their pediatric anxiety treatment program. The beautiful irony was that while we were sitting in the same dining room, where my work had been consistently dismissed as impractical, the outside world was actively seeking ways to implement that work for real-world benefits. Cousin Penelope, who had spent Friday evening researching startup failure statistics, received an email during dessert that visibly shook her. Kat, she said, looking up from her phone, I just got a message from my law firm's technology practice group. They want to know if I can facilitate an introduction because they're interested in discussing intellectual property strategy for your company. The law firm that employed 3 generations of Ravencrests was now seeking access to the family member they had collectively worried about for nearly a decade.
But the moment that crystallized everything came when Cousin Reginald's phone rang with a call from his business school friend who had moved to Silicon Valley. The conversation was on speaker, and we could all hear both sides. "Reg, man! I just saw the news about your cousin. This is incredible. She's building exactly the kind of technology that everyone out here has been trying to develop for years. The venture capital community is calling this one of the most promising startups they've seen in the past 5 years. How long has she been working on this? Reginald looked around the table, realizing that every family member was waiting for his answer to a question he couldn't truthfully respond to. "I'm not sure," he said finally. "We haven't been fully informed about the scope of her work." "Dude, you need to get informed. Your cousin is about to be one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the region. The technology she's developed is being called revolutionary by people who would know." After he hung up, the silence in the room was complete and heavy. We all sat there processing the fact that the person they had spent 8 years trying to save from career failure was being celebrated by professionals they respected as one of the most promising innovators in her field. Finally, Grandmother Octavia spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Catalina, I think we owe you more than an apology. I think we owe you the respect and recognition that the rest of the world has apparently been giving you, while we've been otherwise occupied." Uncle Bartholomew nodded slowly. "I realize now that when I've been offering you advice about business and career development, I've been speaking from a position of complete ignorance about what you were actually building. But it was my mother's response that hit deepest. Sweetheart, I've spent years worrying about your future, and it turns out the future has been taking care of itself. I'm not just proud of what you've accomplished, I'm ashamed that I didn't understand it was happening." The external validation had done what 8 years of my own explanations couldn't. It had forced them to confront the reality that their concern about my career had been based on their limitations, not mine. But as I looked around the table at their faces, confused, embarrassed, and genuinely humbled, I realized that the real validation wasn't coming from Stanford researchers or venture capitalists or even state senators. The real validation was finally understanding that I had never needed their approval to be successful. I had only needed to stop letting their lack of understanding limit my own vision of what was possible. The weeks following that Sunday dinner unfolded like watching a family learn to walk again after years of moving in the wrong direction. The external validation had shattered their assumptions, but rebuilding relationships based on reality rather than misconceptions required more than acknowledgement. It required genuine change. The first real conversation came 3 days after the dinner, when Uncle Bartholomew called and asked if he could meet me for coffee. Not at the country club, not at the family estate, but at a small cafe in downtown Meridian where we could talk without the weight of family history pressing down on every word. "Catalina," he began, stirring his coffee nervously, "I've been doing some research since Sunday. Real research, not just assumptions. I spent Monday and Tuesday reading everything I could find about your work, your industry, and the companies that have been pursuing partnerships with you." He paused, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "I have to tell you something that's difficult to admit. For 8 years, I've been giving you advice about business and career development from a position of complete ignorance about what you were actually building. Worse than ignorance, willful dismissal of something I never took the time to understand."
But what surprised me most was what came next. "I want to understand your work well enough to have intelligent conversations about it. Not so I can give you advice, but so I can finally appreciate what you've been building. Would you be willing to teach me?" The role reversal was startling. The family member who had spent years suggesting I needed to learn about real business was now asking me to educate him about the future of technology and entrepreneurship. Our conversation lasted 3 hours, during which I explained not just what my technology did, but why it mattered, how it worked, and what problems it solved. For the first time in our relationship,
Uncle Bartholomew listened without interrupting, asked questions without judgment, and began to understand why I had been so passionate about work that had seemed incomprehensible to him. "Catalina," he said as we prepared to leave, "I owe you something more than an apology. I owe you the respect I should have shown years ago, and I owe you a commitment to never again dismiss something I don't understand." But the more challenging conversation came the following week when Aunt Cordelia invited me to lunch at the Meridian Country Club, the same institution that had now invited me to speak about entrepreneurship and innovation. Aunt Cordelia had always been the family member most invested in social perceptions and public image. Her approach to our reconciliation was characteristically direct. "Catalina, I need to understand how we got this so wrong, because people are asking me questions I can't answer." She pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages from various family friends and social contacts. "Mrs. Patterson wants to know why we never mentioned having a tech entrepreneur in the family. Dr. Whitmore is asking if we can arrange an introduction to you for her daughter who's studying computer science. The Morrison family wants to invite you to their charity gala as a featured guest." The social implications of my success were forcing her to confront 8 years of missed opportunities to celebrate rather than concern themselves with my career choices. "I keep telling people that we've always been supportive, but then I realize that I don't actually know enough about your work to sound credible when I try to explain it." It was a fascinating admission. Her primary concern wasn't the years of dismissal, but the current social embarrassment of being associated with achievements she couldn't articulate or claim credit for. "Catalina," I said carefully, "what would you like our relationship to look like going forward?" The question seemed to surprise her. "I want to be able to talk about your work with pride instead of confusion. I want to understand why the Stanford Institute thinks you're important enough to recruit. I want to stop feeling foolish when people congratulate me on your success." It wasn't the most emotionally mature response I could have hoped for, but it was honest, and honesty was something we'd been lacking for years. The most meaningful conversation came with my mother, who called me the following Saturday morning with a request that caught me completely off guard. "Sweetheart, I've been thinking about our relationship, and I realized that I've spent 8 years trying to fix something that was never broken. I want to start over, but I want to start from a place of actually understanding who you are and what you've accomplished." She paused, and I could hear the emotion in her voice. "Would you be willing to show me your work? Not explain it to me like I'm a child, but actually show me what you've been building? I want to see your office, understand your process, meet the people you work with. I want to know my daughter's professional life the way I should have years ago." The following Tuesday, my mother spent an entire day at my apartment-turned-office watching me work, meeting my development team via video calls, and seeing demonstrations of the technology I'd been creating. She asked thoughtful questions, took notes, and for the first time in years, seemed genuinely curious about my professional life rather than concerned about it. "Catalina," she said as we prepared to leave, "I feel like I'm meeting you for the first time as an adult. I've spent so focused on worrying about your future that I completely missed your present." But perhaps the most surprising reconciliation came from cousin Penelope, who called me the following week with an unexpected proposal. "Cat," she said, "I've been thinking about our conversation last Friday, and I realized that I spent the evening trying to warn you about startup risks while sitting in a law firm that specializes in helping startups succeed. The irony wasn't lost on me."
She paused. "I want to make you an offer, not because you're family, but because your company is exactly the kind of client our technology practice group has been trying to attract. We'd like to handle your intellectual property strategy, your corporate structure, and your compliance needs, but only if you think we're qualified to do the work justice." The role reversal was complete. The cousin who had spent years suggesting I needed to find more stable career prospects was now seeking to build her own career by supporting mine. "And Catalina," she added, "I want you to know that if we work together, it will be because you chose us for our professional capabilities, not because of family obligation. I don't want to be the lawyer you hired because she's your cousin. I want to be your cousin who happens to be an excellent lawyer." The distinction mattered more than she probably realized. For the first time, a family member was proposing a relationship based on mutual professional respect rather than obligation or concern. By the end of that month, every family relationship had been fundamentally restructured. Not repaired, that word implied fixing something that had been temporarily broken. These relationships had been rebuilt on entirely new foundations: respect for my professional judgment, curiosity about my work, and acknowledgement that their previous approach had been based on limitations they were now working to overcome. The monthly family dinners continued, but with a completely different dynamic. Instead of enduring concerns about my career prospects, I found myself fielding genuine questions about industry trends, business strategy, and technological innovation. Instead of defending my choices, I was being consulted for my expertise. Uncle Bartholomew had begun reading technology publications and would call me weekly to discuss articles he'd found interesting. Aunt Cordelia had started introducing me to her social contacts as our family's tech entrepreneur, with obvious pride. My mother had become one of my most enthusiastic supporters, attending my speaking engagements and asking thoughtful questions about my research. But perhaps the most significant change was in how I approached these relationships. The defensive posture I'd maintained for 8 years had been replaced by genuine openness to rebuilding connections based on who we all actually were, rather than who we'd assumed each other to be. The family that had spent nearly a decade worried about my failure had learned to celebrate my success. But more importantly, they had learned that success could look different from what they'd always known, and that understanding required curiosity rather than assumptions. For the first time in 8 years, I looked forward to family gatherings instead of enduring them. 6 months later, I stood at the podium of the Meridian Convention Center, looking out at an audience of 800 entrepreneurs, investors, and technology leaders who had gathered for the annual Innovation Summit. The keynote speech I was about to deliver wasn't just about artificial intelligence or the future of human-computer interaction. It was about the unexpected journey from family disappointment to industry recognition. But before I began speaking, I caught sight of a familiar group sitting in the third row, my entire family, dressed in their finest business attire, notebooks in hand, ready to hear me address an audience that included some of the most influential minds in technology and business. The sight of them there, Uncle Bartholomew with his carefully researched questions about emerging markets, Aunt Cordelia introducing herself to venture capitalists as Catalina's aunt, my mother wearing a pin that read, "Adaptive Intelligence Solutions," represented a transformation that went beyond professional success. "Good morning," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the auditorium. "My name is Catalina Ravencrest, and I'm here to talk about what happens when the people who love you most become accidentally responsible for your greatest professional breakthrough." The laughter that followed wasn't the kind I'd grown accustomed to at family dinners, dismissive and cutting. This was the laughter of recognition, of people who understood that sometimes our greatest obstacles become our most powerful catalysts. Over the past 6 months, my life had transformed in ways that even my most optimistic projections hadn't anticipated. Adaptive Intelligence Solutions had grown from a one-person operation to a team of 37 engineers, designers, and researchers working across 3 offices. The technology that my family had dismissed as computer games was now being implemented in hospitals for therapeutic treatment, in schools for personalized education, and in corporate training programs for emotional intelligence development. But perhaps more significantly, the company had become a case study in how breakthrough innovations often emerge from individuals working independently, driven by passion rather than conventional business wisdom. Harvard Business School had reached out to develop a curriculum around our development model. MIT wanted to study our approach to ethical AI development. Stanford had invited me to establish a permanent research partnership. The financial success had exceeded even Alexander Chen's projections. The Series A funding round had closed at $120 million, making Adaptive Intelligence Solutions one of the most valuable startups in the region's history. The personal wealth that came with that valuation was substantial enough to make me financially independent for life.
But more importantly, it represented validation of every risk I took and every conventional path I chose not to follow.
Yet, sitting in my corner office overlooking the Meridian River, surrounded by awards from technology organizations and framed articles from business publications, I often found myself thinking about that Tuesday evening in March when I'd finally stopped protecting my family from the reality of my success. The transformation in our relationships had been more profound than any business achievement. Uncle Bartholomew had become one of my most trusted advisors, not because he offered expertise in my field, but because he brought decades of business experience and a newfound humility about learning from industries he didn't initially understand. Our monthly conversations about market strategy and growth planning had become highlights of my professional development. Aunt Cordelia had surprised everyone by becoming an unofficial ambassador for women in technology, using her extensive social network to connect me with potential mentees, speaking opportunities, and collaborative partnerships. Her transition from dismissing my work to championing other women pursuing non-traditional career paths had been one of the most unexpected developments of the entire experience. My mother had perhaps undergone the most significant personal growth, transforming from someone who worried about my future to someone who actively contributed to my present success. She had started attending technology conferences, reading industry publications, and developing her own expertise in the social and ethical implications of artificial intelligence. Her perspective as an intelligent, non-technical person had become invaluable for ensuring our products remained accessible and human-centered. But the relationship that had evolved most dramatically was with cousin Penelope, whose legal expertise had proven crucial as we navigated complex intellectual property challenges, partnership agreements, and regulatory compliance. More importantly, our professional collaboration had revealed capabilities and insights in both of us that family dynamics had previously obscured. The thing about being underestimated, I continued in my keynote address, is that it creates a unique form of freedom. When people assume you're not capable of significant achievement, they stop watching closely enough to interfere with your actual progress. The audience nodded in recognition. Many of them had their own stories of breakthrough innovations developed outside traditional institutional support, of success achieved despite, rather than because of, conventional wisdom. But the more profound realization, I said, looking directly at my family in the third row, is that sometimes the people who love us most can become obstacles to our growth, not because they want to limit us, but because they're trying to protect us from risks they don't understand. The challenge isn't convincing them to support our dreams. It's helping them expand their definition of what success can look like. After the speech, during the networking reception, I watched my family members engage in conversations with industry leaders, asking intelligent questions and making meaningful connections. Uncle Bartholomew was deep in discussion with a venture capitalist about emerging market opportunities. Aunt Cordelia was exchanging contact information with the CEO of a female-founded startup. My mother was talking with a researcher from the Stanford Institute about the ethical implications of emotional AI. They had become not just supporters of my success, but participants in the broader conversation about innovation, technology, and the future of human-computer interaction. Their transformation from concerned observers to engaged contributors represented something more valuable than any business achievement: the evolution of relationships based on mutual respect and genuine curiosity. Later that evening, as we gathered for dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Meridian River, I realized that the monthly family gatherings had become something I genuinely anticipated rather than endured, not because they celebrated my success, but because they had become spaces for authentic connection based on who we all actually were, rather than who we'd assumed each other to be. "Catalina," Grandmother Octavia said, raising her glass, "I want to propose a toast.
not to your success, though we're certainly proud of that, but to your patience with a family that took far too long to understand what you were building. As we raised our glasses, I thought about the journey from that March evening when I'd finally stopped protecting them from reality to this moment when reality had become something we could share and celebrate together. The greatest lesson hadn't been about building successful technology or creating valuable companies. It had been about understanding that you can't control other people's perceptions, but you can control how much power you give those perceptions over your own choices and confidence. For 8 years, I had allowed their misunderstanding to make me defensive about work I knew was valuable. I had wasted energy trying to convince them, rather than focusing entirely on the innovation itself. The breakthrough hadn't come when they finally understood my success. It had come when I stopped needing them to understand it. To Catalina, Uncle Bartholomew added, who taught us that innovation often looks nothing like what we expect, and that the most important thing we can do for the people we love is learn to see them clearly rather than through the lens of our own limitations.
As the evening continued, filled with genuine conversation about technology, business, family, and the future, I understood that the real transformation hadn't been professional or financial. It had been personal, the liberation that comes from building something meaningful regardless of external validation, and then discovering that authentic success creates space for authentic relationships. The family that had once called me a failure was now calling me co-founder, not because titles mattered, but because we had all learned to see success and each other more clearly. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving people wrong. It's building something so undeniably valuable that their opinions become irrelevant, and then discovering that irrelevance creates space for genuine connection. The woman who had walked out of a family dinner 8 months earlier, tired of defending her choices, was now walking into family dinners, excited to share her latest projects with people who had learned to ask the right questions and genuinely wanted to hear the answers. And that transformation, more than any business success, felt like coming home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.